Hello to everyone out there. I am here today with Gene Veith to talk about his own personal journey through life. Gene, great to have you here.
Good to be here.
So Gene Veith is a man that some of you will know from his books, and he's been a professor of literature in his academic career. He is a lay Lutheran Christian. Today, though, we want to talk not so much about topics from his books or things of a theological nature as such, but more about his own personal journey. Who is Gene Veith the man? That sort of thing. So we're looking forward to it, Gene, and thanks for your willingness to do this and reflect on your journey. So perhaps we can start back at the start. Just tell us a little bit about the family you grew up in, and I guess interested too in what was the religious flavour of your upbringing, if any.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a little town in Oklahoma in the United States. This was in the late 50s, early 60s. We were members of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ denomination, which is a mainstream liberal Protestant organization. It's very ecumenical. We were very involved in the church there every Sunday, and then as I grew up, we would go to all the youth activities, both of the church and then the bigger ones and the rest of the state. Disciples of Christ made a big thing about you can believe whatever you want to.
Okay.
We have no creeds but the Bible, but you can believe whatever you want to about it. As a result, they didn't really teach me very much. There were some different, I had some good Sunday school teachers and all, so I learned some things about the Bible and Bible stories and the like. But as a church body, it's almost the opposite of Lutheranism. You believe whatever you want. Later, as we got into the 60s, it was very big on the social gospel. Christianity is not just a matter of personal salvation, it's about saving the world politically by means of implementing progressive social political ideas. And that was what I was getting in a lot of, especially the youth organizations that I would go to. But there wasn't really very much beyond that. Now, when I was in high school, I loved to read. This was when The Lord of the Rings came out, Tolkien's great fantasy. And it really spoke to me. I really loved it. And I remembered that one of the blurbs on the paperback edition, some critic had said, here are beauties that burn like fire, and I forget exactly what it was, but yes, that's exactly how I felt about it. And the person who said it was C.S. Lewis. I'd never heard of it before. And I was in a bookstore sometime after that, and I saw a book by C.S. Lewis, and I remember he was the one that felt the same way about Lord of the Rings that I did. Wow. So I took down that book, and I opened it up, and it was dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien. It was Screwtape Letters. And so I read that, and I was astonished. This is the first person that I came across who really seemed to take Christianity seriously, who really seemed to believe all that stuff. And I read some more of his books, Mere Christianity and others. I saw that Christianity had content to it, and I was so blown away by it. Lewis is talking about Christ as God come in the flesh. But I remember talking to a youth pastor then. I was so excited to read this about Christianity, which I'd never heard in my church. And
still in the church, in that church though.
Oh yes. And I went to another youth conference, and I was talking to a pastor. Said, I didn't realize that Jesus Christ is God. That God became a human being. He entered human flesh. And I was going, because I was so excited about it. And he said, well, we don't really emphasize that anymore. And it was so deflating. But it also showed me kind of the limits of that that mindset, to throw out this amazing things that to me was so exciting. Well, we don't do that anymore. And that's that mindset, that whole kind of liberal theology that changes according to the culture and doesn't offer anything permanent. So, although I was baptized in the Disciples of Christ Church I think it was 10 or so, reading about Christianity from my books, from Lewis and then others that I started reading from him, Chesterton and others, that was really telling me what Christianity was about. And I kind of consider the beginnings of my faith there. But I had very little help from the church. In the meantime, I went off to university, and I still went to a liberal church. I don't know why I didn't see the problems. And then at that time there were all other, any kind of spirituality was socially acceptable except for Christianity. And so there were other things that I was looking at that had more cachet there with my friends.
Non-Christian forms of spirituality?
Well, yes, Zen and Zen meditation was something that I dabbled in, and there were other sorts of things. And I realized that a person needs a church. Just my books were not enough for me, to live the kind of life that I ought to, or even live the Christian life consistently. When I was in graduate school, I started reading the Bible seriously. By then, I had read a lot of theology, but I had never really read the Bible. So I started reading the Bible, and I was blown away by it. It just struck me. I mean, it wasn't just the, oh, isn't that nice? It was the scary parts of the Bible, sort of the Old Testament. And I now have a language for what happened. Now I became a Lutheran much later. It was the law and the gospel. That these scary parts of the Old Testament, this is, death penalty for disrespecting your parents, for doing, all these things that I was doing all the time. And God, I realized I had sort of made God in my image, and here was a God that's not me. And it was but then that same scripture talked about God's grace and promises and his forgiveness. And then I read about Jesus, and remembering about what I learned who he was from C.S. Lewis, it was overcoming. And at that point, I was really I was in graduate school.
So in your 20s, or
20s. Then I became, I guess, what you would call an evangelical Christian, a conservative Christian. And then I started meeting others at the university, getting involved with Christian fellowships and prayer groups and campus ministries. And that was really helpful, because I think a Christian needs other Christians to balance them out and to teach them about it. But I was still going to a liberal church, but it was going through a kind of an evangelical renewal at that time. And that was a good thing to be a part of in our local congregation, even though it was still a disciples' church. But the big thing started happening in my academic studies.
What did you go to study at college?
English literature. And in my research, again, by this time I was very interested in Christianity. And I was my other interest was literature, and so I was looking at Christianity and literature and seeing lots of connections. And for my dissertation, I found a writer that was so helpful to me, a great poet, George Herbert, 17th century Anglican poet, who at that time scholars discussed his work in terms of kind of medieval Christianity, kind of Catholic meditation practices and all. But I saw that he was writing at a time influenced by the Reformation, and that whereas in medieval Christian writing, God was up here, and the poem is about somebody trying to climb up to God. In Herbert's poetry, the person was down here running away from God, and God breaks in on him. Okay. And a picture of God's grace, God's initiative. And so my dissertation, I was studying the influence of the Reformation on George Herbert. So that got me into reading Reformation writers. John Calvin, a lot of the Anglican preachers, and Martin Luther. And at the same time, I became friends with someone who was a real Calvinist, who taught me something that I had never thought of before, the idea that salvation is God's doing. The focus on God's action, God's bringing us to faith. And so I thought that was very powerful. It was very helpful to me. But at the same time, I was seeing some of the issues with Calvinism that go along with that, the way they're developed. But of course, Luther also has that sense of God's grace without falling into some of the difficulties that I was seeing with Calvin. Anyway, so the key event happened. I was elected to be a delegate to our church's national convention, still Disciples of Christ. A couple things happened that year. One, you remember the People's Temple issue with Jim Jones and the poison Kool-Aid? He led this cult that went out into Central America and caused all his followers and mass suicide. And I saw on a television coverage of this a picture of his church in San Francisco, and had the logo of the Disciples Church.
Is that right?
I said, oh, and so I looked into this, and I was told, yes, he was a pastor in the Disciples of Christ, but again, we don't have a way. People can believe whatever they want to in our church. We don't approve of what he did, but there's really no way. And I saw that his theology, which was all about an extreme view of kind of liberation theology, this intense psychological kind of communities that he set up, these were things that were going on in milder ways in the Disciples Church as a whole. And I remember some of the elders in our church going to a seminar and coming back, oh, there's this real good social ministry out at San Francisco this church is doing. And I realized that was Jim Jones. And then I was elected a delegate and went to the convention, which changed the Constitution to eliminate any mention of God the Father because that would be sexist. And I was just sick of it. If I get a job somewhere in academics, because I was about finished with my studies, I'm going to leave this church. Okay. And my wife was with me. I was married by this time, and Jackie was with me all the way on these things. So I did get a job in a little state college in Oklahoma, and looking for a church. There was a little Lutheran church there. We attended. We were struck by the formal kind of worship that we experienced, which is very different for us. We came back the next time, and they started chanting, doing the whole liturgy. Turned out the first time was their informal service, which for Lutherans is going to be more formal than anybody else. But the liturgy just blew us away. It was like stepping back into the Middle Ages. It was like stepping back into some sacred space that it just really spoke to us. And I saw that what the pastor was preaching was the same things I was reading about in my study of Luther. And then the whole sacramental spirituality that was completely new to us. But we kept coming, and we joined the pastor's membership class and did the whole just weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of of study, and we became Lutherans.
Wow!
And so that's the long story of how that came about.
There you go. And so the disciples of Christ, do they still exist?
They do,
Okay.
do, but they've been dwindling,
Right.
dwindling. At that time, I just read something on this. They were a pretty large denomination in the Midwest and in Oklahoma. They still exist, but their numbers are declining very, very rapidly. And the irony is it's churches who want to be like the times that are declining because there's no reason for anyone to really go to those.
And you mentioned Jackie. So how did
Yeah.
you two meet?
Well, we met really the very beginning of our university experience. We went to the University of Oklahoma, both of us, and right before classes, her dormitory and my dormitory, they had an activity where we were cleaning up the duck pond. And so we cleaned up the duck pond together, and so we met just the about 3 days before the start of classes, and so we went through all that together. We got married beginning of our junior year, so
Okay.
we got married during university, and so we were.
Is that very common?
Through that. No.
I wouldn't think so. You had no money and that sort of thing.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But it worked out very well for us. We found a tiny little apartment, and I got a part-time job. She got a part-time job, and we managed quite well and quite happily, even though we weren't following common sense probably and taking that step so early.
Yeah.
But we're glad we did.
And perhaps while we're touching on family things, you had perhaps you can tell us about your children, the children you had, and then also I wonder if any reflections on how family life, your own family life, has shaped your faith.
Yeah. Well, like I say, we were married after our second years of university, so we had 2 more years. Then I received a fellowship to go to graduate school at this was at the University of Kansas, and right before that, the summer before the classes started, we had our first child. Our son Paul was born, and then I guess Joanne was also born in Kansas, the daughter, and part of the motive I think for wanting to change churches was them. You know what?
Brings things into
we
sharp
don't want our
focus,
children to grow up in a church body that didn't teach them what they needed, and we wanted a church that focused on the scriptures and a focus on the gospel. That was our criteria in looking for churches, and we found a Lutheran church, and that was very satisfying. The Lutheran Church had a big emphasis on education. Their Sunday school curriculum had meat in it, and it wasn't just sentimental pablum. And so wanting to have a good spiritual basis for our families, that was a motivator in looking for a good church. And again, I was teaching in this little college, this public college in Oklahoma, for about 6 years, and then had the opportunity to go to Lutheran College, or Lutheran University, Concordia University, in Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee. And so the Lutheran Church in the United States, we're in the Missouri Synod, does a lot with Lutheran schools. So we were able to find a Lutheran school for our kids, and that was a real blessing for them and for us. And it was very easy to make the family kind of a part of our faith. And this is before I understood vocation, I guess, much of it. But I can see that dynamic going on as we with our young family, and as the kids got bigger and more involved, and they went through catechism and confirmation, and as they learned the catechism, they didn't make adults learn the catechism the way the kids had to. So it's sort of getting it secondhand, but that was very good to be able to give them a kind of solid church foundation that I didn't have. I mean, and it wasn't because my parents, I mean, in a way, I had a church foundation.
Yes.
I'm thankful for the habits of going to church every Sunday and going to Bible studies and the like. It just didn't have the substance I found with the Lutheran churches, and so that's really been a precious thing.
And so you had 3 children?
Yes. Then our third child, another daughter, was born back in Oklahoma, where I was at my first position, Northeast Oklahoma A&M, and then later we all moved up to Wisconsin for much of my career.
And so in your career then, just tell us a little bit about what took the bulk of it, what your focus was, and what have you enjoyed most in your working life?
Right. Well, in the academic world, you do writing and research, and I was glad that my dissertation on George Herbert and the Reformation got accepted for publication. Meantime, like I said, I was reading the Bible very intensely, and I was finding it saying a lot about things that I was struggling with. And really, these are vocational issues, I guess. I was interested in poetry and the arts and so on. And well, what does that have to do with my faith? Right now, I'm kind of more interested in my faith and in this other stuff. It doesn't seem as important. Maybe I should be a pastor or whatever. Going through that same process. But I was seeing that the scripture was actually saying quite a lot about the arts and things that I hadn't noticed before or read anyone else talk about. So I had met an editor at InterVarsity Press at a conference, Jim Sire, and so I was corresponding with him and told him what I was finding, and he encouraged me to write it up, and so I did, kind of piece by piece, and he encouraged me to turn it into a book, and his publishing company accepted it, and that. So that was my first book called The Gift of Art, The Place of the Arts in Scriptures. And that got me writing in sort of for the semi-popular Christian marketplace, as well as my academic work. That was published too, as I said. And then it's sometimes hard to break into writing, but once you have, it becomes easier and easier because people ask you to do things. So pretty soon I was noticing things I was reading in the Bible, talking to my kind of academic vocation. I didn't really think of it in those terms, I don't believe, but that was what it was. And that led to another book called Loving God with All Your Mind. And then someone asked me to write about, they were doing a series on Christianity and other areas. They wanted one on literature. They knew that was the kind of thing I was doing. So that led to my other book, Reading Between the Lines, A Christian Guide to Literature. Mm-hmm. And so my interest has been sort of Christianity literature, then Christianity in the arts, Christianity in culture, and then that got me into theologies of culture, like vocation and other things. And then addressing postmodernism, sort of the collapse of kind of contemporary thought as it relates to Christianity and how to deal with that. And so I've read about many different topics, but it all has to do with something about Christianity and the culture, which covers a whole lot. And so, and in doing that, I got invited to do a lot of other opportunities and meeting people and making connections and things in my career. I worked for a while. Chuck Colson started his radio program Breakpoint. Because of these books, I was asked to be one of the writers for him, and that led me to being the culture editor for World Magazine, which is a Christian kind of news magazine. He was the cultural editor of that, and that led to this and that, and so it all sort of grew out of those kind of beginnings. And
you're retired now?
I am, yes.
And how are you enjoying that?
Oh, I'm enjoying it tremendously. People told me that, well, you'll miss, having your colleagues, and you'll miss teaching in the classroom. And I do miss the classroom and my colleagues, but it really has not been hard. It's been joyful. Now my time is my own. I'm still doing a lot of writing and speaking and teaching, but I also can come to Australia for 6 weeks, like I'm doing right now, and it's just a really good time. And people ask, "Well, you've worried about vocation, all this, but now you're giving up your vocation and you're retired. How do you reconcile that?" It's really not that way, and vocation isn't that way either. For one thing, I'm able to spend more time on my other vocations rather than just making a living. I think I'm able to do more with my family. I'm able to do more with my church. When I lived in Virginia, so I was teaching at Patrick Henry College. Our church was way, way over by Washington, D.C., and it was over an hour drive every Sunday, and it was not really involved with it as I'd like to be. Now we are. We're in a little Oklahoma town where we retired to, where my son-in-law is the pastor. More involved with the community in this little town where we live now. I certainly was with many of the cities and places we lived at before I was working full time, and it's just been good, very satisfying.
Good. And one of the things I'm always curious to know when I talk to people about, reflecting back on their life's journey is what, when they look back, what comes into focus as being most important, what are you most thankful for, and also other things that you would do differently if you had your time again. Of course, we all do, but
at the moment when you're in time, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and you have the pressure. I decide to do this or that, or what about this, and you don't know where it's going to go. But when you look back on it years later, you'll see a pattern. You'll see that you were led after all. There's a story by William James called the Pattern in the Carpet that hinges on a Persian carpet. And when you look closely at it, it's all these abstract designs are very complicated, but you can't, it looks like they're chaotic, but when you stand back, you see the beautiful patterns that they form. And I think life is like that. When you're in the middle of it, you don't know what's happening. when you look back, you say, oh, there's a design after all.
Mm-hmm.
And I can really see that. I mean, when I look back, there are a lot of decisions I made that I don't think were the right ones, and I wish I'd done so many things differently. And yet, when I look back, I see that God has brought me through all of this, and that He was there guiding me, leading me, cleaning up after me, making even the bad things somehow turn right usually, and there's a pattern and a design, and so I think I'm seeing that more clearly now that I'm retired, and more grateful for a lot of those things that I really think took for granted at the time.
And you mentioned that we're here in Australia. I think, in fact, you may be my first international guest on Kairos.
Oh,
I'm not
really?
sure. And the reason for that is that one of your daughters married an Australian,
That's right.
and they've both been on Kairos, Joanna and Adam Hensley. So how did that happen? And so how did you end up having this Australian connection?
Of this strange things that happen, and they turn into something big. Well, let's see. In the United States, in Wisconsin, I went to a church was having a program, and the speaker was John Kleinig from Australia, who spoke. Did a wonderful job, and so I got acquainted with him a little bit, and I think he had read some of my writings, and anyway, I got an invitation to come to Australia to speak at a pastor's conference, and then to speak at several congregations in Australia, and then to speak at the seminary for a program there. So this was, when 2002 or sometime, I'm not sure exactly. So my wife and I came over, very excited to come to Australia, and a place we always wanted to go to. And had a great time and going around. And one of the churches that we spoke to between Melbourne and Adelaide was Hamilton, and the associate pastor of that congregation was a young man named Adam Hensley. And so he took us around. We got to know him a little bit, and I enjoyed him, and stayed in contact after that. He taught us about Australian rules football. We taught him about American football. And so we had to commit to follow the Collingwood Magpies. And he had to follow the Green Bay Packers.
One of Adam's faults.
So anyway, so we would actually email each other about the teams and about how that was going. And so we kind of kept in touch after we got back to the States. And in the meantime, our daughter started writing him. Jackie, I encouraged her to write to Adam, and so they started, of course, an online correspondence. And anyway, the rest is history. Pretty soon he came over, and they got married, and then they came back to serve at Hamilton. Then he came to work on his doctorate at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, and so they were in the States for a while, and they lived with us for a while he was writing his dissertation, and then he got a job at Concordia in Irvine, California, and then he got a position teaching at the seminary in Adelaide. So so that's how that worked. Here we are, and again, there's so many things that could have gone differently. I mean, if we were speaking at Hamilton, well, we might have been assigned to speak someplace else, Cooper Pedy or somewhere, and our lives would be completely different, and our grandchildren would cease to exist. Or if we did not follow through with the email, and if we did not report the scores of the Collingwood football team. So all those things could have been very different, and yet they happened, and that connected us to Australia in some really important ways for us.
Yeah, and we find ourselves here, and your granddaughter just had a first communion here at our congregation this past Sunday.
And it meant so much to be here for that.
Yeah, that was a great joy. While we're talking about Australia, any particular reflections on Australian culture as an outsider coming in?
Well, there's so much that I enjoy about it. One of the things I really appreciate this concept of mateship. In the States, I think we've gone farther down the road of losing a sense of community and human relationships, whereas here, friendships are very important, and I'm so thankful for the kind of support, for example, our daughter Joanna has. She has so many friends here. You and your wife, your family, but so many others. And when we're here visiting, we're not just being them, we're seeing all these other folks who are delightful. And that's a very precious thing, and not everybody has it.
Interesting.
And again, maybe we used to have more of that in the United States, but very few people know their neighbors. Very few people have a lot of even acquaintances outside of the workplace or their family or maybe the church, but still there's just a much more sense of very strong friendships. I think it's a lot more important here in Australia. Again, I've heard it called mateship.
Yeah.
And
G'day,
that's
mate.
and that's to me it's a beautiful thing.
Thank you for that. That's good to hear.
I mean, I enjoy so much. There's a lot of kind of quirky things in Australia to people in the world. We just got back from Cooper PD, going into the outback, a town where it's so hot that people dig houses underground, and the area is completely void of plant life or anything else, for the big wide open spaces, which I like, being in Oklahoma and a Westerner. The dog fence, a fence built across the whole country to keep out the dingoes. The fence is wide, is longer than the United States is wide, and it just, that's Australia, very unusual, very ingenious, very quirky, but very, very cool. So things like that I marvel in and enjoy every time we come here.
Well, we're glad for your Australian connection, and we many of us in the Lutheran Church of Australia have appreciated your books over the years, and I know Spirituality of the Cross. I can name a number of different people for whom that was hugely influential in their Christian journey, including people close to me, and so it's great to have you here today, Gene, to talk a bit more about your personal journey, and thank you very much.
Okay, well, enjoyed being with you.
God bless you.
Thanks.
Okay, and now quickly for the bonus lightning round with Gene Veith. Gene, if you were an animal, what would you be and why?
Probably a cat.
Okay.
Cats are the introverted animals, and I kind of relate to that.
Curl up on the couch and
Sleep all day. And,
do you have a favourite movie?
Citizen Kane.
Classic.
Yeah, I like the classics.
Favourite band or musician?
That'd to be Bob Dylan.
And favourite place in the world and why?
Probably Veneta, Oklahoma. Little town I grew up in. Nothing much to recommend it to anyone outside, but every time I go, there's so many memories, so much complexity that I just love going there even today because it brings it all back.
What was the name again?
Veneta.
Veneta. If you had to sing karaoke, what song would it be?
Like a Rolling Stone. One of the reasons I like Bob Dylan is because I'm not a very good singer. I can sing like Bob Dylan, and that's about it.
I didn't tell you about this part, but now you actually sing it for the recording. So, yeah. What was the worst job you ever had?
Growing up, I worked at a Dairy Queen when I was in early years of high school. It's a little franchise that sells ice cream. And I think of that because I took my grandson in Oklahoma, Michael there, he's about 6, I think, and I was telling him, I took him to the Dairy Queen, bought him some ice cream, and said, did you know that I used to work place like this? And he said, why did you get fired? And for him, this is the greatest job. You'd have to be fired.
Yeah.
Why would you go and professor? But for me, it wasn't. But I mean, that showed me the relativity of it all.
That's right. Character building jobs, we call those.
That's
ones.
right.
Yeah. Now, this is an interesting question for an author and a professor of English literature. What's a book that we should all read that we probably haven't?
Okay. The Temple by George Herbert. George Herbert's probably the greatest Christian poet. And The Temple is a collection of his work. Mm-hmm. And he's so satisfying doctrinally, talks on the gospel, the Reformation, and he's such a great master of the language. And yet almost no one, including Christians that talk a lot about Christianity and the arts, almost no one has read him. Mm-hmm. And to me, that makes no sense at all. So, George Herbert, remember that name.
Put it on your list, folks.
Yeah.
Best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I think it would be, don't collect things, collect experiences. My wife came up with that, and so instead of spending her money on things, we tend to travel
to Australia.
Right, travel to Australia. We have lots of memories.
Flinders Ranges.
Yeah. And so I think that's been really good advice.
Very good. Last one. If you could talk to the 18-year-old Gene Veith, what would you tell him?
It's all going to work out. It's all going to work out.
Well, that's a good place to leave it for today. Thanks again, Gene.
Okay.
God bless you.